Surprise! If you know my teaching style, I wanted to include a practice in here. Essentially, you're just going to be rewriting that same line of code that we just wrote in the last lesson. However, this time we'll extend it just a little bit. I want you to see if you can figure out how to render an unordered list with 2 or more list items inside. Last time we just rendered a paragraph. You can see it's still kind of left over here. If I refresh that, that'll disappear. I've left the entire setup here for you. We're still pulling in the script tags for React, React DOM, and Babel. So essentially, your main focus is just to rewrite that same one-liner of code, but see if you can figure out how to add a couple more elements inside, like having an unordered list with some nested list items. Pause here and try to work on that challenge. Okay, pulling in the React DOM library that gives us access to a render method. Before we did a simple paragraph like this and put some code inside. However, I can put this as an unordered list and then just actually stick some list items inside of here. So it's going to look a little confusing at first. I'll clean it up in just a minute. We have list item, we'll just say thing 1, and I'll do another list item here, thing 2. Okay, now I'm going to move this onto its own line here, this whole HTML thing right there. And the second parameter I need to separate with a comma is where to put this. So I'm going to use document.getElementById root. And let's cross our fingers, see how this goes. Cool. Okay, hopefully that was some good practice. Now let's keep moving forward and learn a little bit more about why we care about React. One more thing that was highly requested from the first time I recorded this React course was how can I set this up on my local environment? Everything that I'm doing will be done on scrimba.com so that you can interact with the same code that you see me writing. However, it's also a good experience to run it locally on your own computer and get a feel for what it would be like to actually develop React on your own computer. Again, our setup here is more of the easy way than the right way, but for now what you can do is you can click the little gear icon in the lower right of your Scrimba editor, which will pop up a little menu here, and there's an option that says download as zip. That will download a zip file containing the files that we're working on here. You can uncompress that like you normally would any zip file and open that up in any editor that you'd like, for example, Visual Studio Code on your own machine. Now, in order for that to run, I'm going to show you what that looks like on Visual Studio Code. Inside of Visual Studio Code, which is what you see in this screenshot, there's a menu icon for some extensions, and you'll need to search for an extension called Live Server. It's created by Ritwick Day, and you'll need this installed to your VS Code in order to run the code that we have written in React. So you'll click the little install button. That's going to put an icon down at the very bottom menu bar in Visual Studio Code that says Go Live, and all you need to do is click that Go Live button, which will open a web page on a local server. I think it's maybe port 5000 that it runs, and that should launch your own React project on your local machine. As soon as you see me move toward a different setup for React that includes Webpack and downloaded dependencies from NPM and so forth, this is no longer going to work in quite the same way. But for now, for those that are curious, I thought I might just explain how you can get this set up on your own machine. Okay, that's enough delaying. Let's keep moving forward with the course. Let's talk for a second about JavaScript libraries and JavaScript frameworks. At this point in your learning journey, you may have heard these terms before and wondered really what the difference between them was or what they were in general. So let's jump right in. First, we'll talk about what a library is. A library is simply a collection of reusable code. It's code that someone else has written, I guess unless you are the author of your own library, that tries to reduce the need to write the repetitive or complex things that you sometimes find yourself having to write over and over again from scratch. Adding a library to your existing project is a really common thing to do. You bring in the code from a library to help try and solve a specific problem that you're facing in your already existing code base. As such, you get to control how and when that library or the code from that library is used. There's very few boundaries. Of course, there's going to be documentation on how to use that library, but the library often will not really care what the scenario is in which you're using it. Some tasks that are solved by libraries include things like data visualization, dealing with date times and time zones. Sometimes they can be really small, like making the text in your terminal show up as a different color, or they might be a bit more overarching and be something like the React library, whose job is to give you a declarative and composable way to build in the front end. Now, it's arguably debatable to legitimately call React a library these days. It handles so many things that some people do tend to consider it more of a framework than a library. In truth, I personally think it's a bit esoteric to debate whether it's a library or a framework because in the end, it doesn't really matter. But speaking of frameworks, a framework is generally different than a library in that it has a predetermined architecture. Rather than pulling it into your existing code base, you often will start a new project, or at least a portion of your project, by following the predetermined pattern given by the framework. As such, you have to work within the boundaries that are set by the framework. Usually there is a right way to do something in the framework that you're using. The JavaScript ecosystem is very quickly evolving. I thought it could be kind of fun to look at a bit of the history of some of the popular libraries and frameworks that have come through the front-end development world. In 2006, jQuery was introduced. I'm guessing this is not the first time you've heard of jQuery. It was around for a very long time, and its goal was to make interacting with the DOM much easier than it was at the time, especially with the kinds of differences that developers had to deal with in 2006 between each browser, or in other words, dealing with cross-browser compatibility. jQuery not only gave a more terse and simplified syntax for interacting with the DOM, but it also reduced significantly the friction for developers when they had to consider every different environment that their code might be run in. Then just a few years later, starting in 2010, some of the biggest initial frameworks started emerging. AngularJS at the time was just called Angular. Ember, Backbone. If you've been in web development for a while, you probably recognize these names. AngularJS was written by Google and had a huge adoption rate. In fact, when I first started learning front-end, I jumped right into AngularJS. A few years later, another group of frameworks or libraries emerged, namely React, Angular 2 at the time as it was called. Now the names have switched a little bit. The modern version of Angular is just called Angular, and the old version was rebranded as AngularJS, and Vue.js. And I'm positive you at least recognize one of these names as we are now talking about React in this course, but surely as you've done your research, you have also heard of Angular and Vue, and just a few years after these came out, Svelte came on the scene, and these four frameworks or libraries here consist of probably the largest number of developers that are using them today for front-end web development. So of all the libraries and frameworks we see here, why are we choosing to teach React? For me, the primary reason to teach React over any other library or framework is that it has the highest demand for jobs. Of course, when you're looking for a job, you want to be able to demonstrate that you're capable of learning any library or framework or even language that you might need to learn for that job. However, choosing to learn the library that has the most number of jobs available already, frankly, it just makes a lot of sense. React also has the largest ecosystem of any of the other libraries or frameworks that we saw. From a learner's perspective, it also contains contains less magic happening behind the scenes. In other words, in React, a lot of times the right way to do something is by using vanilla JavaScript. This allows learners of React to rely more heavily on the JavaScript ecosystem and to generally become better JavaScript developers rather than developers specific to whatever library they're learning. As far as I know, all of the libraries today have a strong focus on composability and having a declarative paradigm for coding. If those words don't make sense to you, that's okay. The next two scrims are going to be talking about these specifically. And React is still under active development. There's a strong community and a strong support system behind React that helps it continue to evolve as time passes on. At least at the time of recording this, React has been around for a decade now, and it doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. So with so many jobs being available in React or any of these other frameworks, you might be asking yourself, do I really even need to learn JavaScript before I just jump right into React? And my personal, unhesitating, emphatic answer is absolutely yes. As an educator, I cannot imagine a world in which I would choose to teach React as a way of also teaching JavaScript. Conflating the core language of JavaScript or interacting with the DOM in JavaScript with how React chooses to handle interactions with the DOM, I strongly believe would be the absolute wrong approach to learning web development. This is why in the very introduction to this course, I strongly emphasize that a prior knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will be necessary before continuing on in React. You certainly don't want to find yourself in an interview or in a position somewhere where it becomes clear that you don't understand the difference between the core language and the framework or library itself. Now, I've really talked up the whole using a library thing. However, there's going to be plenty of times when you might not want a framework at all. If you're working in a small project, installing the entire React library just to build one little view is probably going to be overkill for what you need. Also, using these libraries or frameworks does include a significant amount of overhead that has to be downloaded to your users' machines. If you have concerns about the network speed of where your app is going to be used, then maybe a framework is going to be overkill for you. There's also a more significant learning curve. Assuming you already understand how to interact with the DOM in JavaScript, learning React isn't quite as simple as just spending 15 minutes looking at the documentation. There also could be some maintenance concerns as React or whatever framework you're using evolves. Trying to keep your app as updated as possible with the newest version will include some overhead, or you might be working in an existing project and that project may not be very compatible, or at least not easily compatible, with introducing a completely new framework. In all of web development, there's going to be trade-offs, and these are just a few things you might want to consider before jumping both feet into learning a new framework. Okay, let's come back to some of these topics that we were just talking about, and next we're going to dive into understanding React's composable and declarative nature. Let's spend a little bit of time understanding why we even care to learn React. One of the main reasons that people will talk about is how React allows us to write composable code. So what exactly do I mean by composable? Well, an analogy that I came up with has to do with sculpting. If you think of the statue of David, for example, this statue was created originally from a single giant block of marble that was then sculpted down to the sculpture that we know today. So in the end, what results is one giant single piece that makes up this piece of art. Now, what if instead of starting with one giant piece, we instead used a bunch of small pieces to put together something that is greater? These are Lego bricks that obviously are small, each in their own right, that were put together to create something large. In this example, they all kind of work together to accomplish a goal, so to speak, the goal of looking like the statue of David. Now, this example is not perfect because the original statue of David obviously is more beautiful than this replica made of Lego bricks. But hopefully the concept makes sense. Let's look at an example in actual web development. What I have here is copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, that's really not important right now, but it's enough to know that these 30 or 40 lines of code copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website represent a navigation bar that is pre-styled. Now, in the old days of web development, a single page on a website was usually a single HTML page. So if this is just the nav bar, a lot of times those web pages would end up being thousands and thousands of lines of HTML code, essentially making it one giant sculpture. Well, with modern frameworks like React, we can take code like this and we can put it into our own custom components, and we can put those components together to make something that is larger. But in our case, our code becomes a lot more maintainable and a lot more flexible. You can see I've given these kind of silly names to show you that these are not regular HTML elements. I can combine elements together that are real HTML elements, like you see here, into my own custom component called, for example, my awesome navbar or my awesome footer. We're not quite ready to dive into the syntax of React quite yet, but I'm going to give you a taste of it and a chance to play with it before we move on. So let's see this in practice. Over here, you can see I have my React DOM.render, and I'm rendering a custom component called navbar. And if I scroll up, you'll get a chance to see how I created that navbar. As a quick aside, one thing you might notice is that I'm using class name everywhere instead of class. That's not a mistake. That's just how you have to assign classes in React. We're going to cover that later. But for now, I'd like to give you a challenge that's going to require you to deduce what I've done here and try to replicate it for yourself. So let me put that here. Okay, your challenge is to see the navbar component that I have created and see if you can deduce how to create your own component called main content. It can return something really simple like a single h1 element, and afterwards I want you to render it below the navbar. You'll have to figure out how to render it below the navbar. Now, I've changed this a little bit for reasons that we'll talk about soon, but this line here, 51, this is where you're going to figure out how to render your own custom component main content. So first, build your custom component, looking at my example above to try and figure out how to do that, and secondly, render that component down here in React DOM.render. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, following the example above, we see that I created this component by creating a function, and the name of the function is the name of my component. So I will open up that function and return the content that I want to show up on my page. Above, I created a set of parentheses because I have many elements that I'm trying to return. I'll just do that just to keep things consistent for now. We'll create our h1 that says I'm learning React. And secondly, I can take my main content and I can render it by making it look kind of like an HTML element. In this case, it's a self-closing one, so I have main content as a single tag here, and if I hit save, we'll see that my h1 actually showed up on my page. And that's the concept of composability. It goes quite a bit deeper than this. We're going to see how we can make our components much more composable and reusable, but for now, let's move on to another reason why people really love React, and we'll cover that in the next lesson. Another major reason people love React is because it's something that we call declarative. So let's talk about declarative. To understand declarative, it's helpful to know that its opposite is something called imperative. When a program is declarative, we can simply tell it what should be done. More specifically, it's like the computer saying, just tell me what to do and I'll worry about all the nitty-gritty details on how to get it done. Its opposite, imperative, is when we need to tell the program how it should be done. Like the computer saying, I need you to describe to me every step along the way how to do something and then I'll do it. Up until now, if you've mostly been just using vanilla JavaScript anytime you needed to create elements on the page, you've been doing it in an imperative way. In fact, let's go look at what that has been like. I've commented out my React DOM.render and I'm going to put a challenge here for you. Okay, your challenge is to recreate this above line of code where we are rendering something to the screen using vanilla JavaScript by creating and appending an h1 to our div with the ID of root. We have our div ID of root. You'll need to select it and then append a new element. And I give you the step-by-step instructions right here. One little caveat is I don't want you using inner HTML because that kind of breaks the analogy down a little bit. Generally speaking, this is actually just a good way to practice the vanilla JavaScript that you have been learning so far. So it's always good to give it some practice. I'll give you a couple lines here, pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Okay, let's work on this. So I'm going to create an h1 and I'll use document.createElement and I'll make an h1. And then if I'm giving it some text content, I need to use the text content property of this DOM node and set it equal to, I don't know, maybe this is an imperative way to program. Then I need to give it a class name. So I'll use the class name property here and set it equal to, I think we said header. And finally, I need to append it to my div with the ID of root. So first I need to say document get element by ID root and then use the append property or method to append my h1 to the DOM. So when I hit save, it should show up. This is an imperative way to program. Perfect. Now this example is a little bit on the nose because if you were really just putting something static that had nothing to do with user interaction, you probably would just go to your HTML page and stick it right inside the div here, right? But with React, we're building our entire page in JavaScript. And so doing something imperatively this way where I have to tell it step by step how to create the element and then to add some text content and then add a class name and then append it to the DOM, that's going to get old pretty fast, especially even with something mildly more complicated than a single H1, like a very simple web page like this. As soon as we have more than one element, suddenly our 4 lines of code will become probably dozens or maybe even hundreds of lines of JavaScript code just to create and append all of these elements in the correct order and in the correct way. And so that brings us back to the idea of writing our code declaratively, and React allows us to do that in a really simple way. As we see back up top, when we comment this out and uncomment this, we essentially get to write our JavaScript as if it were HTML. We are relying on React to figure out how to turn what we have declaratively written as an H1 into the JavaScript code that's needed to append it to the DOM. In fact, if I were being strict and wanted to make this more equivalent, in order to add a class name, I can just add a class name as if this were an HTML element. Again, this is class name instead of class for a good reason, which we'll talk about, but that's a pretty minor difference to be able to do all of these lines of code in one single section right here. And that difference is going to compound as we get into more and more complicated UIs like we see here. So at this point, I could probably continue talking about different reasons that we're choosing to use React and that it will be really beneficial for you to learn React. As you see on my little list here, it's a very hireable skill and it's actively maintained by really skilled people at Facebook. However, at this point, I think we're overdue to just jump into the syntax, get your hands on the keyboard and start learning and practicing React. So when you're ready, let's keep moving forward. Okay, let's finally address this elephant in the room, what we're looking at here, why we have what looks like HTML stuffed right inside our JavaScript. Well, fairly early on in the days of React, the React team created a syntax that's called JSX. JSX stands for JavaScript XML, but that's not terribly important for you to memorize. What's most important is to think of it as sort of a flavor of JavaScript that looks a lot like HTML. And with the introduction of JSX into React, it really made it so that React was very declarative instead of imperative. We can see up above what it took for us to create an H1, give it some text content, and give it a class name in regular vanilla JavaScript. But with JSX, the benefit is that we can just write what we're already used to writing with HTML. Now there's a couple of small differences. For example, instead of using class, I need to use class name. So I might say class name equals header, for example. And there's a few other of these, but for the most part, with JSX, we can just write the HTML that we're used to writing. At first, it might be a little bit confusing to write your HTML inside of your JavaScript, but I promise as you start doing React, it's really going to start making sense. You're going to learn to love JSX. Now, one thing that was really helpful for me to understand as I was learning was to see the difference between what JSX is and what our regular DOM elements are. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to uncomment these lines of code here, and I'm also going to take this piece of JSX and set it to a variable. We'll call it element. Then I can fix my React DOM.render by just putting element down here, and this will work exactly the same. But this allows us to console log it. So let's console log element, and I'll hit save so that this code will run. I'll open the console, and we'll see the differences here. First of all, on line 4, we are console logging the DOM element that we created with document.createElement. And that's what shows up in our console as what looks like an HTML element here. So that's this line right here. However, when we console log our element that we created with JSX, what actually got returned to us was this. So let me copy this out. And we can see that this is just a regular JavaScript object. Let me clean it up just a little bit to make it even more clear. So in the end, what we get from JSX, or rather what React is creating with JSX, is actually just plain old JavaScript objects. And those objects describe the DOM element that we want React to put onto the page for us. And if we look closely, we can see some interesting information here. First of all, we see that it has very similar properties. Like we have class name where we're setting that to header. And down here we have props, or short for properties, and we have class name. We also have something called children, and we can see that's actually the text that we put inside of our h1. That's about all I care to touch on with the object nature of React elements, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of kick us off understanding that JSX is kind of like a function that, when it's run, returns us objects that React can interpret and use to create actual elements that get put on the screen for us. I'm going to comment this out so we can talk about one more thing, clean up this a little bit. And I'll go ahead and put this directly back in line to my React.render, move these onto their own lines. The last thing that I wanted to touch on was that with JSX, we need to make sure that we are only returning a single parent element. In other words, I can't take this one h1 and place, say, a paragraph directly next to it, because in this case, we're rendering or attempting to render two sibling elements that sit side by side. In fact, if I try to run this, you can see React complains, and I guess in this case it says unknown error. Sometimes it will say that you have to wrap the elements that you're trying to render in some kind of parent element. Now, this doesn't mean that I can't put two elements on my page at any given time. It just means that I need to wrap them in something like a div, for example. So if I say a div that has an h1 and a paragraph inside, now I am rendering just one parent element, and it doesn't really matter how many children elements are included, as long as I have one parent element that I'm rendering. So I can hit save. We'll see that this is working just fine. Now, remember how I was able to save my h1 as a variable? Well, I can actually save a whole collection of JSX, for example, this div with the h1 and the paragraph, as a variable. So let's say const page equals, and then I can paste in my elements here. Now, to me, this looks a little bit crazy. So normally what I like to do is move my elements, my JSX, onto their own lines as if this were HTML. But in that case, I need to go ahead and wrap everything in parentheses. Now, take a second and think, how is it that I can then fix what I have down here? We can see we have a syntax error. How can I fix this so that when I refresh the page, this is still working? Pause here and see if you can figure out how to make this work again. Well, all of my JSX is being saved under the variable of page, so I should just be able to put page here and hit refresh, and sure enough, that's working just fine. Hopefully some of you were kind of curious to see what this looks like as a JavaScript object. If we console log page, we can see that essentially we got what we had last time, but this time it's a little more involved. Specifically, in the children property of our div, we see that there's other React elements in there. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. Feel free to copy and paste what you see in the console, maybe clean it up a little bit and analyze it. But the point is, I can save a whole bunch of JSX into a single variable and then use that variable kind of like any other variable. And the key is, that's because what I'm getting back when I write my JSX is just a JavaScript object. Okay, I'm going to clean this page up a little bit, and I'm going to comment out our page because I'm going to give you a challenge. Okay, I left our example of const page up here just for reference, but I did delete our code that we had at the bottom, which actually enabled us to put something on the screen, and that's because I want you to practice it again. So your challenge is to create a navigation bar using JSX. I've given you some instructions here on what the content should actually be, and as I mentioned at the very end, don't worry about styling yet. We're going to cover styling soon, but for now, what you're going to have is just going to look like plain HTML that's unstyled. So pause the screencast here and see if you can complete this challenge. Okay, before I worry about the React DOM.render bit, I'm going to create a new variable. We'll call it pay. Actually, let's call it navbar. And I'm going to use my parentheses so that I can start my element on the next line. And like I mentioned, we want to use the semantic nav element. And inside of there, I'm going to have an h1. Let's call it Bob's Bistro. Maybe this is a restaurant. Okay. And then we have an unordered list. And hopefully while you were playing with this, you came to realize that it doesn't matter how nested I get. Just like in HTML, I can nest this as deep as I want. We'll create 3 list items. And it said pricing, about, and contact. And I don't know, maybe if this is a restaurant, I'll say menu instead of pricing. Okay, I've got my JSX for my navbar set up. And then the last bit, which was just meant to be something repetitive that allows you to get some muscle memory for this, is to use React DOM.render. And the first parameter is what do I want to render? And that's my navbar JSX. And the second thing is where do I want to render it? I'm going to do that by selecting with getElementById my div with the ID of root that is over in my index.html right there. Okay, I should hit save, and sure enough, it's pretty ugly. Obviously, we want to style this. We're going to get to that soon. I hope that challenge went well for you. If you struggled, please don't keep pushing forward. Go back, rewatch this lesson, see if you can do this again from scratch, or maybe just try typing it 10 or 15 times if you need to. Also, if you get totally stuck, don't forget that this is a community. You can reach out on Discord, ask your question, and you are more than likely to get a really friendly, helpful response back. When you're feeling pretty good about this,
Hey, Treasure here. Before you move on with React, I'd like to show you how you can deploy this project to the web in just a few seconds using Netlify. It's a really good idea to get into the habit of deploying the projects you work on. It's an important skill to have in your developer toolbox, and hopefully you'll find it motivating to be able to share your projects to the web, post to social media, and things like that. I won't go into too much detail about this, but because we've set up the React project using Babel standalone, we can deploy to Netlify in one very simple step. Just keep in mind for the future that if you are working on a React project that is not using Babel standalone via the CDN, there will be a couple of extra steps to deploy to Netlify. I'll be back to cover that later in this course. The first step is to make a Netlify account if you don't already have one. So you can click the link or the image to go to netlify.com, and once you're there, you can click sign up. You have several options to connect an account, or you can use your email. And once you've done that, you'll be taken to a Get Started page. You can fill out however you'd like, and then scroll down and click Setup and Continue. That's all you need to do with Netlify at the moment. So back in your Scrim, you'll want to download the project files by clicking the gear and download as zip. Once the zip file is on my computer, I can unzip it, and here's my project folder with all of my project files inside. Now go to Netlify's drop site. You can click on the image or the text to go to app.netlify.com/drop, and all you'll need to do from here is drag and drop your entire folder into the site, or you can browse to it. Just make sure that you drop the whole folder and not the individual files. And that is basically all you need to do. Once you do that, you'll be taken to this site overview dashboard, and Netlify will automatically generate a random URL for your site. At first, it will say site has not yet deployed, but after a couple of seconds, you should be able to refresh, and here is a link to your project. If I click on this, you can see my project is now on the internet, and this is a link to it, just like any other link. You can send this to your friends, send this to your grandmother, post it to social media, whatever you'd like to do. Let me review really quickly, just in case you weren't following along with me. To deploy your project, you'll want to sign up for a Netlify account, download and unzip the files from your Scrim, and then drag and drop your project folder to app.netlify.com/drop. Keep in mind that this deploy method will only work if you're using Babel standalone. You'll learn more later about React projects that are set up a little differently. Have fun continuing to learn about React, and bye for now.
Hey there, I'm Gil, a teacher at Scrimba. Nice work completing this section of your React course. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts and questions racing through your mind about what you're learning, and maybe even starting to think of projects to build with the new concepts you've learned. While learning React is fun and essential, it can also be a challenging library to learn, especially if you're quite new to JavaScript. So it's completely normal if you find yourself revisiting various lessons throughout this course, or even previous JavaScript lessons to help you better grasp React. You can become skilled at React and a job-ready front-end developer with meaningful practice and guidance. So one way Scrimba students help accelerate the learning curve when it comes to learning React and JavaScript is by joining the Scrimba Bootcamp. One of the best parts about learning front-end development and React is building your own projects, seeing your ideas come to life, and getting meaningful feedback along the way. It gives you a sense of accomplishment like no other. So as a Scrimba Bootcamp student, you can access exclusive projects designed to challenge and improve your skills. And the best part is that our vetted team of code reviewers will provide a detailed review of your React projects to ensure you are improving, coding with best practices, and getting the most valuable feedback possible. So if you're looking to take your React and coding skills to that next level, get regular code reviews from experienced coders, and make your portfolio stand out, then the Scrimba Bootcamp will be great for you. If you're interested in learning more and joining us in the bootcamp, check out scrimba.com/bootcamp or click on this image. And to review a comparison between what the Scrimba Bootcamp offers versus the pro subscription, click on this image right here. All right, I hope to meet and chat with
Okay, at this point, it's probably time for us to switch away from the easy way of getting React set up in our project to the more correct way. Now, inside of Scrimba, that means something different than it means inside of your own local environment. Scrimba has kind of some magic that's happening under the hood that's helping React just kind of work in our project. So I'm going to show you a couple steps for how I do this in Scrimba. You won't really have to worry too much about that, because even when you're creating your own new Scrim in Scrimba, it'll just ask you what type of Scrim you want, and you'll just tell it that it's a React Scrim, and it'll set everything up for you. So what I need to do is in my index.html, I'm actually going to remove all of my unpackage.com CDNs here. So I can get rid of these 3 lines. And I don't need this type text Babel anymore because I'm not pulling in Babel. And instead, over here on the left, I'm going to add the dependencies that I need. And I need React, and I need React-DOM. If you're a little bit more familiar with developing in JavaScript, you might recognize that these dependencies are similar to having a package.json where you install these packages through npm. If pretty much everything I just said doesn't make sense, don't worry about it at all. I am going to talk about different options for local setup later. If you absolutely need to follow along in your local environment instead of here on Scrimba.com, you can continue to use the CDN way that we were just using like this. But otherwise, I just recommend doing things here inside of Scrimba. Our main focus is not going to be how to set up React, but rather how to write React. So I will take those back out. And now that I have taken those CDNs out, it means that I no longer have global variables added to my window like React DOM. So if I try to save this, we're going to see I have an unexpected token angle bracket. And that's because, well, it doesn't know what React is at all. What I need to do now is actually import React from React. This might not seem like it's doing anything because I'm actually not referencing React anywhere here. I've got React DOM, but that's something different. However, React is where the JSX syntax is defined, and so I need to import React in order for this to work at all. Now, the astute among you might be familiar with the fact that with React version 17, I technically don't need to import React. However, currently, at the time of this recording, Scrimba is not yet set up to support the fact that React version 17 and above no longer requires you to import React in order for JSX to work. So anyway, throughout the duration of this course, I will be using import React from React, and that's because, well, I need to in this environment currently. Let's hit save again and see what we run into next. And this says, cannot use import statement outside of a module. And oh, you know what? I think that has to do with another sort of magic piece that is happening under the hood with Scrimba. So I'm going to add this .pack. That's not something you'll need to do in the real world. So this should be, yep, React DOM is not defined. That's the error I expected to see. And that's because whenever we're using React DOM, I will also need to import React DOM from React-DOM. And now, fingers crossed, I should get something that works again. Okay, there we go. We're back on the screen, and everything is set up a little more similar to how you normally would see a React project setup. Don't be overly concerned with all of these implementation details. However, this is how I'm going to be setting up my projects from here on. And at this point, we actually have enough knowledge for us to start working on this section's project, which is a static HTML page in React. However, before we jump into that, I want to exercise your brain with a little thought experiment, and we are going to do that in the next screencast. Before we move on, I wanted to include a quick update. Since this course was originally recorded, React has released React version 18 and React DOM version 18, and there's actually a pretty fundamental change to how you set up a React app from the beginning like we show here. I think this update will be helpful, especially for anybody who is following along on their own machine and installing React from scratch, because React is automatically coming in as React version 18 now. And you're probably getting a warning. The change has to do with how React is rendering its root element, which, as we see here, originally is React DOM.render. You tell it what you want to render as the first parameter to the render method. And the second thing is where you want to render that, or the root of your application. Let's go ahead and update our dependencies to React 18. This is probably not something you're able to see, but you'll see these numbers change to 18.2. And then I'm going to hit save, and we'll see we get this new warning in the console. Now, everything is working just fine, but it's telling us that React DOM.render isn't supported in React 18, and we should use something called create root instead. It also lets us know that until we switch to using create root with the new API, the app is going to behave as if it's running React 17. There's a lot of other really cool improvements that come with React 18 that we are not going to be able to use unless we change the way that we are rendering our application. Fortunately, it's really simple. So let's close the console for some space. The very first thing we need to do is we are not going to import React DOM just from React DOM, but instead from a sort of subfolder called React DOM/client. So that's the first change, really simple. Second, instead of having render take two parameters, what you want to render and the root of your application, where you want to render it, instead you need to create a root first and then use that root to render what you want. I'm going to comment this out just for reference, and on the next line, I'm going to write the new way of doing this as a chain, and then we'll see how this oftentimes is represented like in the React docs as maybe not a chain, but separate commands. That'll make more sense when we do it. So first I'm going to say React DOM.create root, and I need to tell it where I want the root to be. And so that's going to be my same root element here. I'm going to grab my document.getElementById root, paste it in there, and now this will return something called a root, and that root has a method called render. And render is going to be what we want to render. So I can put my navbar here. You can tell really we're just adding this method call to create root, and we're sort of rearranging the order in which we're doing things. Now I can hit save, everything is working, and our warning is gone. It may not seem like it, but under the hood, we're now running React 18 with all of the extra benefits that come with React 18. Now I'm finding that the documentation doesn't usually, or at least doesn't very often, write the create root this way. Instead, they create a root as a separate line, and then they render that root. And so I just wanted to show you what that looks like so that it isn't confusing. Usually you'll see something like this that says the root is from React DOM.create root. And then we have our document.getElementById call here. And then separately, they'll say root.render the navbar in our case. These two things are essentially equivalent. One takes two lines and one takes one line and chains the methods together. I believe there are other things you can do with root besides just render. So doing them on separate lines will give you that power if you need to. For everything that we do in this course, we would really just be rendering our JSX that we want to render. So if you're following along locally, you're more than welcome to just do this all in one line. Or of course, if you want, you can do it in two lines. Now, because the remainder of this course was already recorded, I'm not going to be using this going forward because the course will still be using React 17. But now if you're following along locally, you'll know exactly what you need to do to follow along using React 18 without having to worry about that warning that keeps popping up. Okay, that's everything. Let's keep moving forward. I'd like to do a quick thought experiment with you, and that is to figure out why we're using React DOM.render instead of just using the DOM append method that you've probably used before in JavaScript. I've written the first line for you, and that's to import React from React. That will just allow you to write some JSX. Your challenge, as you can see in this little 4-step process here, is to create just a really simple sample page in JSX. It has to be greater than or equal to 4 elements, just to get your fingers working a little bit. And I want you to save that JSX to a variable. Remember that that variable needs to be one parent element with some children elements nested inside of it. In other words, we can't just have 2 sibling elements saved in a variable in JSX. Then I want you to select the div with the ID of root using whatever selector you want to use, and then use .append to append your JSX. If you need to do a quick Google search for how to use .append, that's totally fine. And then before you run your code, I want you to see if you can guess what's going to show up in the browser before you run the code, and then run your code and see if you can explain what does show up in the browser. Pause here and play around with this a bit. Okay, well, let's create our JSX. We'll say const page equals, and I'll open my parentheses so I can write my JSX on its own line. And we'll start with a div just to surround everything. And I don't know, let's say I'm making a page about why I love React. We'll say this is my awesome website in React. And then maybe an H3 that says, here are the reasons I love React. And we'll use an ordered list. It's not terribly important what you actually put in here. I'll just use some of the reasons that I've been talking about. It's composable, it's declarative, it's a very hireable skill to have. Let's see, I need to get rid of this. And it's very actively maintained by some very skilled people. Again, the JSX you chose to put in here is not terribly important. So we'll use document.getElementById root, and then use the DOM nodes append method to append our page, and we'll see what shows up here. Now, of course, I know what's going to show up, so I'm just going to run the code, and we see that we get object. This object is sort of a string representation of a regular JavaScript object. Something I can do to actually make that object appear is to stringify it using JSON. So I can actually say json.stringify, and we will stringify that object so that it puts JSON on the page. I'll hit save. And look at that, we get a JavaScript object. Now, step 4, see if you can explain why this actually shows up in the browser. Well, kind of the whole purpose of this thought experiment was to remind you that JSX returns plain JavaScript objects. At this point in time, it has nothing to do with the DOM. It's not recognized by the browser as anything important dealing with the DOM. It's only when we try to render it using React DOM.render that React can take these JavaScript objects and actually turn them into real DOM elements that the browser can interpret as things like first level headers or ordered lists. So let's go ahead for the sake of practice and fix this. I'm going to update our challenge here. Okay, simply put, your challenge is to fix our code. And don't forget, we're not using those CDNs in our HTML anymore, which is what used to give us a global variable called React DOM. So you'll have to see if you can remember how we get access to React DOM. Pause the screencast here and try to fix our code. In order to use React DOM, I will need to import it, and we'll import it from the React DOM package. Then instead of selecting my div with the ID of root, actually I'm going to need that anyway, so I will leave that code there. I'll say React DOM.render. The thing I want to render is my page, so we'll put page, and the where I want to render it is inside of that div with the ID of root. I'm going to comment this out so it doesn't break it. We'll hit save, and there we go. Awesome. So simply put, React DOM's job, or the React DOM.render method's job, is to take React elements and interpret them in a way that turns them into real DOM elements that the browser